Thank you all for coming here. It's a great little intimate group. Everybody should move down front. If you want to, please, because there's so few of us.
And like I said earlier, there's a mic over there that should be working. If you have a question once we get going, feel free to step over, and sure, Steve will be happy to answer it.
I will. Well, within reason.
Well, yeah.
Depends on what the question is.
We covered that.
I mean, you know.
Let me make sure that's on zipping.
Same here. Turn it off. Right. How is everybody? Yeah, it's been and you made it. You got here. Somebody got you here. He was just at the table.
He was excited. He comes in and he goes, "Where should I sit?" I go, "Anywhere you like, sir. Wherever you want." And he was like, "I'm going to be there." Right there. Steve, welcome.
Thank you.
How has the weekend been? It's day 3.
It's been good. It's been good. It's been one of those kind of ebb and flow weekends. Sometimes there are big crowds. Sometimes there aren't. It's very comfortable. I like that.
How is it interacting with the fans without a
that's always
a friend?
Great. I love that.
Is that
yeah. You know, it's really funny about that because and it was the same with Jim Henson. The Muppets were thought of as kind of as tools. You know, I used to say if Jim was a carpenter, Kermit would have been a hammer. You know, because he really thought of them as the tools of how he did the art that he did. You know, it was like a paintbrush in a way. You know,
what you joined Henson in '78?
Yeah.
When you're a kid, what is the moment where you're like, puppets?
You know what I really think it was. There were a couple of big ones. When I was about 5 years old, Jim was doing this character called Rolf the dog on the Jimmy Dean Show, like way back in black and white TV days. And I was
That's like Rolf V1.
Yeah, the original one. You know, that was one of Jim's first big gigs in the business. And I remember watching that as a little kid, and especially because everything was black and white images at that point. Rolf had this big black mouth. You know, so when he opened his mouth, it looked like a big hole, like you could climb in. And I remember thinking, even as a little kid, that must be how they get inside the puppet. You know, it was going through the mouth because it was this big hole. You know? But I knew it was a puppet even when I was a little tiny kid. But I just felt so drawn to it because it was so alive. You know. And then when Sesame Street came along, I was about 10 or 11 years old, and
not quite too old.
Not quite too old, but definitely not too old for the characters. Yeah. I mean, I had pretty much learned my ABCs by then. But I watched, I'm from Atlanta, and it was on twice a day in Atlanta, the same show in the morning and then again in the afternoon. So I would watch the show in the morning, and as I got more involved in building my own puppets, because they were all copies of what I saw on Sesame Street, I would have my little cassette tape recorder, you know, to record the audio next to the TV speaker. And I would like in the morning I would take notes. You know, I'm 11 years old. And in the afternoon I'd say, okay, right after they do the ABC song, they're gonna do Mana Mana. So I would be ready, I would record it. And then I would take that and play it back and do the puppets like for my friends, you know. So that I became really obsessed early. So that was the time when I thought, this is something I really want to do. I don't think I was thinking of it as a career at that age, but it was certainly something I wanted to keep doing.
So how did you go after these? You're 10, 11, you're taping it off the TV.
Yeah.
Most of these tape. What's tape?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
You know, but, so you're taping the stuff off the high quality TV speakers back then.
It was so pristine.
So what do you get? I mean, that can't be a cool high school hobby to have.
Well, yeah, it was unique. It was unique. What made it acceptable, being the nerdy puppet guy, was that whenever we would have to do a report in front of the class, I would always do it with puppets. And very much the same way as what they were doing on Sesame Street. You could teach something with puppets very easily. The class loved it, the teachers loved it, and everybody wanted to work with me on my team because it was like, you knew you were gonna get a good grade.
That's an A.
You were gonna get a good grade, easy. So, you know, it became a thing that was okay, you know.
Like being the weird musician.
Yeah,
so he's a weird
yeah.
kid, but he plays guitars at parties,
exactly.
and the girls like him.
Exactly.
Okay, so you get through high school.
Finally.
Where at college?
I did not attend college because by the time I got out of high school, this place right here next door where CNN is now, like has the whole building, they opened this place called the World of Sid and Marty Krofft. Now I don't know whether you guys know who the Crofts are or were.
Some of us do.
Massive producers of children's entertainment in the 60s when I was growing up. They had a character called Puffin Stuff. It was this big dragon.
H.R. Puffin Stuff.
And they opened the world's first indoor theme park, and it was right there, like next door to this place where we are now. So as a 17-year-old kid, I had a job there, and my job was to walk around the park all day long with one of my own puppets that I had built, talking to people, just greeting people and saying hello. It was a dream job for a high school kid, you know. And I was making, you know, $150 a week, and it was fantastic, you know.
That was a mint back then.
Yeah, and I was still a huge fan of the Muppets. That has still been my inspiration, but I wasn't particularly necessarily looking for a job with the Muppets. So when that show ended, a local TV producer had seen me at the theme park. He was starting his own television channel. At this point, remember, there were only like 3 TV channels. There wasn't cable and all that. So I did a local television show here in Atlanta for about 6 months, during which time I met Carol Spinney, who was the man who was Big Bird and Oscar the Grouch. Carol came here to Atlanta for a puppetry festival that was associated with what is now the Center for Puppetry Arts. At the time, there was no Center for Puppetry Arts. It was just a group of people who did puppet things. And I'd never been involved with them. I didn't even know they existed. But I heard about the fact that Carol Spinney was going to be in town. I wanted to meet someone who worked for the Muppets. Again, at 17, not thinking of a job. I just wanted to meet one of my heroes. So I did. And I was the only person at this little puppet gathering who had Muppet-style puppets at that point. You know, the moving mouth, the rod hands, all that sort of thing. And as a result of that, I met Carol, and I thought that was it. And about 3 months later, he got in touch with me and said that Jim was looking for new people to join his team for the Muppet Show. So Jim had already been doing the Muppet Show for a couple of years, and I'm working at Sid and Marty Krofft. And I never saw the show because it was on while I was working. But long story short, too late, I met Jim's wife, Jane, here in Atlanta. She came through town because remember the big Kermit the Frog balloon that was in the Macy's parade? Still is, I think, sometimes. They built that at the Goodyear plant somewhere in Middle Georgia. So Jane came down to approve the balloon kind of thing. And I met her at the airport. She took a videotape that my friends at the station helped me put together back to Jim. And then I heard from Jim and got hired. Almost sight unseen, just by the tape.
How old were you?
I was 18 by then.
18?
Yeah. Pretty big deal. You know?
Well, yeah. You've been copying his work for that long. And,
that's right.
And whatnot. So where did you start? I mean, because the Muppet Show, I mean, because it started with, you know, Jim and Frank.
Yeah.
And it grew and it grew. So obviously his crew had to grow.
Right.
So he's always bringing in people, obviously looking for talented people that I think understands the way he's doing things, which you clearly were.
That's true.
So what's, you know, in the military and maintenance, you know, you get the new kids in. What do you? Well, he carries the toolbox.
Yeah.
What was your job?
The equivalent
when you
of carrying,
first come on.
Sure. The equivalent of carrying the toolbox was to assist other puppeteers with what they were doing, because most of the characters would, not always, but generally it helps to have 2 people in a character. There's the person who's actually performing the character, doing the voice, and then you could run the other hand. You know, you can make the other hand move, or you could handle props or help out. So I did a lot of that in the first early days. And the truth is, because I was so young, Jim was looking only for a couple of people to bring in at that point. He had his normal 5 basic people that he used on the Muppet Show. He was looking for 2 more puppeteers. And I had an understanding of the Muppets, but really what Jim liked to do was bring in people who didn't have a great deal of experience and sort of mentor them in the way that he liked to do things. So it was incredibly fortunate that I came in when I did, because I got to learn sort of at the feet of these 5 maiden people: Jim, Frank, Jerry, Nelson, Richard Hunt, and Dave Goles, who was only there about 5 years before me. But they all had very different styles of performance. Their puppetry was quite different. And I got to sort of learn the distinctions between those styles in kind of forming my own way of doing it. It was great, you know. Oh yeah, if you're gonna, you don't want to learn from just one guy. You want to learn from as many people as exactly.
you can.
So when you ask if I went to college, that was almost as though I was going to college to learn this, you know.
Master's program.
Yeah.
Your PhD in puppetry.
Exactly.
If you will.
Exactly.
So when do you get to drive the boat, so to speak?
The first character I was ever assigned, like a speaking part on the Muppet Show, because remember, I had done puppets for years, and I had done things at high school where I did voices and stuff, but I wasn't comfortable with that. And I was never really an actor, per se. I was a guy who knew how to make puppets work. So the first time I had to do a character, it was the most intimidating thing in the world. And it was an anonymous character that was this very tough guard, like an FBI, CIA guy with an earpiece, glasses on, outside of Liberace's dressing room doors, because Liberace was the guest on the show. And he had to be very mean to Kermit. His point, the way it was written, Kermit was trying to get in. This guy was not going to let Kermit in. And I just didn't have it in me to be mean to Kermit,
even mean to Kermit.
Even through a character, yeah. I could do it now, but back then I didn't know how to do this. And Jim very patiently, you remember the backstage on the Muppet Show? If you do, it was the balcony area up there. So you're very secluded when you're working up there. You can't see the crew, you can't see the cameras. It was just me and Jim and Kermit and my mean guy. And he just very slowly worked me through the process and let me learn. And that's just exactly the way he was. And it was still terrible. But it went out over international television nonetheless. So that was the first thing. Then they gave me this little dog named Fufu, which was Miss Piggy's white poodle. And the idea with Fufu was that it barked and growled, and I could mimic all those sounds. We also had a real, actual dog that looked exactly like the puppet. And we would do these shots where the real dog would be up on like a little pedestal with a staircase. The real dog would walk down in the shot and go behind, and the puppet would come out the other side. Then it was a puppet. So it needed to look very much like the real dog. So it started me down this path of trying to do characters in a way that was very organic to real life, which followed me through all my years. Came in handy when we did something like the Dark Crystal,
Yeah.
So that was my first early stuff, and then eventually I found this rat puppet, and it became Rizzo, and it was almost like a more real.
You found him. Did you find him up here?
No, I found an actual puppet.
So it was just this.
It was a puppet in a box. It was tattered and used and terrible, and I had it pop in next to Kermit on one of the behind backstage things. Kermit's doing his lines at his desk. Fozzie goes through, Gonzo goes through, and this little rat popped up next to Kermit and just stood there throughout the scene listening to Kermit. And Kermit would make a comment, and this rat would think about it and nod, and he'd look at Fozzie. So he had no lines. He was just, we were allowed to do whatever we wanted to do in those backstage scenes. Jim said, grab a puppet and do whatever you want to do.
Oh, wow. That's got to be just incredibly freeing.
We were welcome to draw all the attention away from the main characters, which is what I was doing. And at the end, Kermit had some serious things to say, and Jim just turned to me and just cracked up laughing because he got distracted by what I was doing. And
While he's running Kermit.
Yeah, he's still doing his thing, but he knows what I'm doing. I'm drawing all the attention to this little rat, And he said, where did you find that terrible puppet? Because it was terrible. It was like falling apart. And I said, it was in a box back here. And he said, well, we're going to make that rat a star.
First we're going to rebuild him.
And he said, I want you to redesign it. I want you to work on rebuilding it. And I worked with one of the main puppet builders to rebuild this thing and redesign it. And so there was Rizzo all of a sudden. But Rizzo really didn't become a strong character until about 3 years later. We did Muppets Take Manhattan, this film that we did. And suddenly I was much more comfortable with the idea of doing a character.
Right.
And Rizzo kind of blossomed.
Well, he was yours. I mean, you weren't trying to slide into someone else's someone else's headspace in that character,
which was always the case. I mean, everybody there was, we didn't know Jim was going to pass away, and there would be a void left there. There was no plans for anybody to take over anybody else's characters ever. So I was really working on establishing this little character that I would.
So back then, it really was almost a one for one.
Absolutely, always.
So if someone had just quit, say in 1982. Theoretically, those characters there would have been a lapse, a hiatus.
Yeah, there was no thought of a backup plan.
That would never fly now because someone owns those intellectual property rights.
Well, yeah. It actually it's more common now than it would have ever been then. They would just recast these days, but that was not even on the radar back in Jim's days. Once he hired a puppeteer and cast that person, because there were casting calls, there weren't auditions for characters. Jim said, we're going to build a character for Steve. We're going to, Frank's going to do Miss Piggy. And that was the way it was going to be. And then it kind of became, really Jim was the first character, really core main character where it was, and we're jumping ahead a bit, but it became necessary to recast.
Yeah. So the Muppet Show, it feels like it ran forever.
Yeah,
I don't even remember how many years it ran. It's been on forever.
Yeah, it has. It was 5 years, and Jim, it was at the height of its popularity, and Jim actually chose to stop making it at the height of its popularity because he thought, well, this is a great springboard for us to do all kinds of other projects, and it was. It was.
What was your besides finding Rizzo in a box and cracking? How often did you crack Jim up? I mean, how often did Jim lose it? Did you get him off track?
Oh, we tried to do it all the time. And the best thing was when Jim, it was just when we would all get into these laughing fits. You know how you get when you get punchy. And sometimes we'd have to stop shooting because we're just all these immature people who are just laughing instead of doing our work. And there were times when the crew was like looking at their watch and thinking, oh my God, these people, these Americans, because we were in England, these silly Americans, and we can't control ourselves. So we just have to stop and reset and try again,
Favorite guests that you got to interact with on the Muppet Show?
Well, that's a tough one. There were so many of them. We had a different star every week. Some of them were from, like the golden age of Hollywood, people I had grown up with as a kid, Bob Hope and Danny Kaye. And
I'll bet Danny Kaye was a riot.
Oh, he was, well, honestly, he wasn't.
Really?
He'd seen everything. He was not an unfriendly guy, but he wanted to do one take and then go back to the dressing room.
Oh.
He was one of those guys, But on the show, he's wonderful. He's brilliant.
Well, famously Mark Hamill.
Yeah, and those guys were favorites because that was during the high point of the popularity of the original Star Wars films, and Mark Hamill and Anthony Daniels and C-3PO and Peter Mayhew, they all came on and did their characters, And then we got to go to the Star Wars premieres, which was very cool. It's a reciprocal kind of thing, which is fun. And we have lost contact, but we stayed friendly for years, after that.
Yeah, and a lot of work between Lucas and Henson.
Some.
Later, and especially in the later films. George's Puppetry. So you get into the films then.
Yeah.
Muppets Take Manhattan, a Muppet Christmas Carol, which everyone loves, a Muppet Christmas Carol. What do you remember about shooting those? Because that's different than shooting a TV show.
Right.
Shooting a film. How does that change your approach? Well, as puppeteers, how do you guys now have to look at this going in?
The initial change to it all happened right after I joined the company because I'd only been there involved on the Muppet Show for about 7 weeks when it was time to go shoot the first Muppet movie. And Jim asked me to be a part of that, so we all go to Los Angeles to shoot this film. It was Jim's first Muppet feature film, and obviously mine. And one of the things Jim came in, we all talked about around the set of the Muppet Show before we went over was that this is going to be a whole different experience. Suddenly the Muppets that were created for a small television screen are going to be 40 feet wide on this massive screen. And we ran the arms with these arm rods, wires. So they're going to look like telephone poles, So there was, and at that point, these days, they can remove those in post, but back then you couldn't do that. So they were going to be on camera. So we were trying to keep the hands down low to the bottom of frame, so you didn't see that so much of that. Did you
have to extend the poles out sometimes to do that? Because the framing is different.
A little bit, and it was mostly about just trying not to show and trying to color them like the background or something. And it really didn't work very well. But I remember Jim redesigned Kermit's hands at that point. Kermit had always had these, if you look at the early stuff, these fingers that were all gnarled up, and the hands were just...
They almost just like flat felt.
Yeah, fingers. It was just nothing in the hands, and they just flopped around. And Jim said, I want to make Kermit's hand a little bit more like a human hand with a little curve here, and put some wire in the fingers so they can be posed, which is how Kermit was going forward. And we all worked on toning down the movement that we were doing, so it wasn't this thing that was just strobing across the frame on a film, So a lot of changes. And again, that sort of headed us in the direction of these more organic characters. Even though the Muppets are big and they do big things, but aiming towards something like Dark Crystal.
Well, they always felt, you talk about, today they'd remove the rods.
Right.
It's like that almost feels, like not really a Muppet.
Well, it was very when the Disney years finally happened and we started seeing them removing these things, it was very jarring for us because it was just an accepted thing. we were kind of against it. And then it suddenly became something that we were used to. But we had to learn a little bit about moving differently because the hands, it's one thing when you're leading a movement with your hand. Mm-hmm. Suddenly when you don't see what's doing that, it looks funny because it's not coming from the shoulder of the character anymore.
Right.
It's like it's weird. Well, we had to learn how to make it look better.
It's kind of, to do that kind of pulls a chunk of your performance out of the thing. That right. rod is a huge part of your performance.
Yeah.
So we get Muppets Take Manhattan, Muppet Christmas Carol. Let's talk. Which came first, Labyrinth or Dark Crystal?
Dark Crystal.
Dark Crystal came first.
Yeah.
Let's talk about this now. That's a jump.
Yeah.
In everything, in scale, and
it sure was.
In cost, in exposure,
in every way,
in every possible way,
and particularly in the style of those characters.
How does that start? How does Jim walk in and go, we're going to do this thing that no one has ever
well,
done before?
Jim did that all the time. He even did that with the Muppets. We're going to do this today. We're going to shoot something that no one's ever done before. He was always doing that kind of stuff, even with the Muppets. On the Muppet Show, we were early just really pushing the boundaries of shooting things on a blue or green screen and trying to chroma key and ultimate things in. And it looked terrible back then, but Jim was always, we'd do it anyway. It was state of the art at the time, it would take hours and hours and hours and go over budget, and Jim, we just kept plowing through because he really wanted to use that kind of technology. So Dark Crystal comes along. Most of that was still practical sets and practical effects and not a lot of kind of matte shots and things like that. Most of it was there. Those sets were, 7 times the size of this room. And you walk into those huge, massive sets, and you were there.
Well, because the puppets themselves were
huge.
Right. They were puppets, but they weren't puppets.
They were quite big. And then there was the style of the performance, Again, we had kind of slowly been working in that direction with the regular Muppet characters. But it was the idea that these were supposed to be living, breathing things. The Muppets were a little bit more abstract in their movements. And, we'd all been inspired by what Frank did with Yoda by then. Right. And it was pretty impressive. And so that's the style we were suddenly going toward. And to a degree, we got there. And I look at it now, and I'd say, well, we could have toned that down a little more,
Right. But it's still a fantasy film, so
it's still pretty cool.
You have a little leeway.
That's right. and Dark Crystal, it was really state of the art. It was the first film I know of that was all puppets on that scale, and trying to make these things look like they were really alive, more than with the Muppets, in that regard. So it was a whole different style. We would go sit at, like I would go over to Hampstead, this place north of London, where I was living. And there were these little sidewalk cafes, and it was warm weather, so you could sit outside. And I'd sit there and I'd have lunch or something. A bunch of us, puppeteers. And we'd look across the street at people walking down the street, and you'd kind of do this and look at them from the waist up, to see just what they look like when they actually walked. Because the Muppets, you've seen Sesame Street, especially the early stuff, it was, that's how they walk. But suddenly you're trying to make these things look real. So that doesn't really look real. Nobody on purpose walks that way. And suddenly you realize that instead of doing that, we were just doing this. It was all it was. It was that small. That's all it took to read walking movement, a huge difference. And instead of the mouths working like that, they were working like this. That's all you're doing. It's very, very small, very tiny movement, and trying to make that seem as believable as you could.
And then you were doing that, but then you scaled the puppets up for the sketches and the.
That's right. That's right.
Like, so that's a way you have to blow it up, but you have to tone it down.
That's right. Even with them, they've got these big floppy mouths, but you're trying to make it look pretty small and really feel like that sound is coming out of them.
You're inventing a biology of of a new creature. So
exactly.
That would be interesting. You were the scientist.
Yes. Yeah.
In there, How much design? What was the design work like for all of the sketches on that? Were there roughs from the top, or were there character names from the top? And then
it's interesting. The Skeksis as I'll say species, but as a type of puppet, were all similar on the inside. It was a harness that we wore that fit tightly around our waists. The characters were not as tall as we were. So in other words, the Skeksis only came down to just below our waists, and our feet were below the floor. So we're standing, but they were half as tall as we are. Whatever size they were meant to be in real life, the actual puppets ended there. So we're standing, if this is the set, our legs are down below it, right? And the Skeksis are up here. So we're waist deep in these pits in the floor with as many as 8 people around us, because everything was practical effects. So this little trigger did the eye blink, and this little trigger did a little pulsing thing, or this did some breathing, or, So you got a different person on all that. So you had to get this team of people coordinated around the dialogue and around the movement, because they're all moving along on their knees and stuff, trying to keep up with you if you had to walk. So all of that was just incredibly cumbersome to do, and then trying to make these things do an actual performance with them. I forgot what your actual question was. I got up on that.
How did you design the characters? Was that was it this character, just character names, and then whoever was that guy got to design it?
Yeah.
Were there ideas from up top that you guys got to play with?
Well, the ideas were based on Brian Froud's artwork. The whole world was based on Brian Froud's artwork, if you guys know his work. He does this incredibly beautiful stuff, paintings and drawings and sketches. And he designed all the characters and worked together with Jim and that creative team to come up with, what they needed for the story. This person had a certain job, and there was the scientist, and there was the general who, took care of the big guys called the Gartham, these big, cockroach guys. And so the characters were designed as a part of the story. But the puppet design was similar in each one of them. We were inside in this harness. We had our hands like this in the head. We were running these triggered fingers that were like a thing you could do this with. It ran all the fingers out here. And if we needed the other arm to work, there was another person inside running that arm. So you had, 8 people in each character. So in those big scenes where you see them all in the scene, there were, 80 people sometimes running puppets at one time, trying to coordinate together, really hard, really difficult.
How long was that shoot?
My recollection is that it was about 6 months, which is a long film shoot.
Yeah.
We did most of our Muppet movies in 3 months or so.
And it's harder, with puppets. It's because an actor, it's like, just go reset.
They're so temperamental.
With a puppet, it's like all 6 of you.
Yeah.
Go
they're so temperamental to work with.
My wife and I went over to the Center for Puppetry Arts on Friday morning. And there's a Henson exhibit in there. And the one thing we stopped and we saw in Dark Crystal was the Striders.
Oh, yeah.
And that was, and the reason I asked about design was because the thing they were talking about was the way they had to adapt what they wanted to do, because they couldn't make what they wanted to do work. They wanted like 6 or 8 legs trying to move.
Right.
At the same, and they couldn't figure it out. And the next day, one guy said, "Hold on," and he came in with the 4 stilts.
That's right.
And it's almost like an elongated gorilla gallop. Almost.
Yeah.
And they were like, "Yeah, we can make that work." Is that how many problem-solving issues did you guys? Because on any puppet that complex like a Skeksis, there's got to be things coming together like this is just not working.
There were issues of varying degrees every day. You could do your best planning, and you walk in and you start trying to shoot something, and this thing doesn't work on camera. You remember that? That scene? There's a scene in there where Jen, the lead character, walks by this wall of all these little, it looks like moss, but they're all little eyeballs, So it was like 20 puppeteers trying to get into this little space to get all their hands in there so they could, things like that, trying to get so many people in a small space, trying to make mechanics work so that it worked on camera, trying to coordinate when a person, because we treated these like people in terms of when they blinked. How often do they blink? And we kind of came up with this theory, it's not necessarily true, that it made sense for these characters to blink when they turned their heads, because their eyes moved as well.
Yeah,
so we'd blink and the eyes would be in a new place. It's not really accurate to human life, but it sort of worked with the characters. It was early days of radio-controlled things that were always breaking down. So Jen's eyes would stop working and they'd start doing this and jumping around, so many problems.
So many problems. But you got through. Was there ever one thing that Jim just had to go, we can't, we have to change it?
I don't recall that, but I would not be surprised if that was the case, because Jim and Frank were co-directing this film. So we'd have these giant scenes with all these people. Like there's a scene where all the Skeksis are having a big banquet and they're eating food. all these characters, so you can imagine all these puppeteers underneath. Frank would come around, and Jim was dealing with something with a lighting issue or cameras or something. Frank would come around and say, so in this, here's what we want you guys to kind of be thinking and doing, and here's the thing. And then 20 minutes later, they're still lighting, so we're just waiting. And Jim would come around and he'd say, so I'm thinking in this you do this. It'd be just the opposite of what Frank just said. And so we became accustomed to saying, you guys should probably get together on this particular thing, because
compare notes.
Yeah,
That's
a lot
awesome.
of that.
And obviously that was huge. The Dark Crystal was huge. A couple, few years later, then Labyrinth rolls around.
Yeah, Labyrinth was an interesting one. It seemed to morph into something different than what Jim's original idea was when David Bowie came on board.
What was his original?
Well, chiefly it wasn't going to be a musical. It wasn't planned to have songs, people breaking out into song in it,
Which is weird, because music has always been a huge part of the Muppets.
Yeah. Well, and to me, it works because of that. You kind of break the reality when the villain starts to sing. But Jim just went, that really speaks to Jim's nature as a collaborator. Because instead of saying, no, we want you, David, but we don't want you to sing. Well, he wanted to do songs for it. He wanted it to have this musical component. That was a little closer to the earlier days of music videos, so it kind of made sense for a rock star to do that. And I mean, it wouldn't be the same without the songs. At this stage, we would say, oh man, those were great songs. Why weren't they in the movie? But at the time, it was a little bit weird, to make it work. But David wanted to write music, so Jim said, okay.
He says no to David Bowie. Like a lot of the earlier Muppet movies, people and Muppets are interacting, not like the Dark Crystal at all, where everything's a puppet.
That's true, yeah.
So now you've got this people in a fantasy setting.
Yep.
How hard was it for them to try to work? I mean, how hard? I mean, I'll bet Bowie had a great time, but how hard was it for him to kind of adapt to that environment? Well,
with all of our guest stars, I think there's a certain moment where they realize what it means to be talking to a puppet instead of to a person. And sometimes what it means is, with the hand puppets in particular, we will, if you guys are camera, I mean, you're all over the place. But if these are the eyes, and it looks into camera, that's one thing. But when it turns to look at you, we might cheat it a little bit. It might be better to see this eye. So the puppet, you're talking to something, it's like if I was talking to you like this, and you're having to play to me as an actor that way.
Right.
They're not quite, so people have to get used to that. And they just have to learn that, okay, it's not really going to look at me, maybe,
And don't fall through the holes in the floor.
There's always that. Yeah, watch your step. There's always spotters and people making sure people don't fall.
Make sure you don't break Bowie.
Exactly. That would be a bad thing. And it has happened. I can't recall a guest star ever falling, but crew has fallen, Nobody died, but people get hurt. Yeah.
Point A to point B. So, and then Jim passes.
Yeah.
That as performers, all of you, that's just got to rip your heart out.
It was horrible. It was a horrible time. It was during the time when Jim was attempting to sell his company to Disney. And it would not just have sold the characters, it was his whole company.
Right.
And then Jim would have had this kind of deal with Disney, my understanding is, for about 5 years. And then he would have been free to go do whatever he wanted. But the cool thing was, when Pixar came along, anybody knows who John Lasseter was, he was the big guy at Pixar. And John came in as this new creative force within Disney and had a lot of free reign to come up with projects, do whatever he wanted. Well, that would have been Jim. And Jim was looking forward to that freedom of just suddenly all these projects he wanted to do. He would have been like stepping in as a new Walt Disney almost, in a certain way. Yeah. So he was looking forward to it. And there are all these issues. You read all this stuff. There was a lot of problems with the deal. And the deal was different than the discussions. And, it's the way showbiz goes. So Jim was under a lot of stress. And we shot this thing. Jim loved being in the theme parks. He loved the idea that the Muppet characters were going to have this new home in the theme parks, even though he might not be as involved with them as he used to be. So he went to visit his parents. He contracted this virus that was this incredible virulent strain of strep. Like we all had strep throat as kids, but this was a different strain of it. And he couldn't fight it off. So that's ultimately what took his life. Otherwise, Jim was this 53-year-old guy. I remember when I went past 53 thinking, oh my God, he was only this age, because I was much younger than that when he died. And it was terrible. Jim was an incredible friend as well as our leader and all that stuff. So would the Muppets go on? We didn't know. And
who kind of stepped in, and how was the course of the Muppets determined at that point then?
Well, Jim left the company to his kids, to his 5 kids, to own it. And they basically, Brian came to us and said, ask us, because Jim did fill so many roles, and suddenly, so Brian's running the thing and would have some creative stuff, of course, presumably, and he was a puppeteer. But then you've got the side of Jim that did all these massive characters that were Jim's characters. So we basically got together within a few days after Jim died, and the thing was, do we want this to go on? Do we want to even make a go at it? Can we do it? And we all unanimously said yes. So
Jim would have wanted that.
Well, that's what we thought, because obviously he wanted it because he was selling his company to Disney. He wanted it to continue, but could we do it? And so we said, yes, we're going to make a go of this. So that led to the first big project, which was Christmas Carol. But in between that time, the whole Disney deal fell apart. The company did not sell to Disney. We did a series called Dinosaurs during that time with the Walt Disney Company. So it was Henson co-producing with Disney and a third production company who was the writing team. And there's all this stuff going back and forth about the deal and all this friction, but we're producing a show together at the same time, and it's a great show. I mean, it doesn't show in the series. And ultimately, the company did not sell to Disney, but we went on to do a lot of work with Disney, like Muppet Christmas Carol.
And so you got tapped to play
for Kermit. Yeah.
Now because Jim did a lot. I mean, Jim wasn't just Kermit. Jim, again, was everywhere. Did you guys get together and go, who do we think can... was there
No, it was a much more organic thing than that. And it's very much the Jim method of doing things. Rarely did Jim ever hold auditions for puppet characters. He basically had his core team of people, and then there were people beyond that core team that were kind of a secondary tier of a core team. And he said, well, this is a perfect character for you, or you. And it really wasn't a competition. There was no audition per se. Right. He'd take you to dinner and he'd say, do you want to do this character? And you'd say yes, or you'd say no, and that was that. But he had a sense of the right character matched with the right performer's sensibilities. So evidently, unbeknownst to me, he had gone to his wife Jane, and I think maybe Frank, a couple of people, and said he didn't know he was going to die. But he thought he was going to become, because he's selling his company, he said, it looks like and I'm paraphrasing, of course, I don't know the exact conversation, but he said, I may become too busy to continue being a performer because he's going to be this huge creative force at Disney. And he said, I'm thinking about, if that should happen, I might ask Steve if he wants to do Kermit going forward. But he and I never talked about it.
Really?
It wasn't a plan, it was a notion. Right? So when he actually passed away, Jane and his wife and Brian and Frank, called me into their hotel room one night. We're still all at Disney World because everything's still going on with Disney, and asked me if I'd be willing to give it a shot. And Jane said, he had essentially, for all intents and purposes, had chosen the next person to do this. So that said to me that Jim considered the Muppets. He had his legacy, but within that legacy, he looked at it as a lineage. He wanted to pass this on to specific people. And it's exactly what I would have thought Jim would have wanted to do. Not have a massive audition where you have 50 people come in and recast a character.
Who is the next James Bond?
Yeah. This puppeteer, you would choose your replacement, the next Gonzo, the next Fozzie, the next character like that.
I think we have a couple minutes left.
Okay, sorry, I'm talking on and on.
We got a few minutes left.
Okay,
If anyone
good,
has any
good.
questions, please feel free to get up and ask them.
Yeah, I'd love.
My favorite Henson project, of course, is Fraggle Rock.
Yes.
Wembley, of course, is the bestest Fraggle.
I agree. I agree that he's the best.
He's the best. Plus, he's the inspiration for one of my favorite science fiction heroes, Hoban Washburn from Firefly. I needed to get that on the record while I had it on stage. Fraggle Rock is fun. They rebooted it a year or so ago on Apple TV. It's more of a mix of CGI. I don't know if you've seen it. I don't know.
I have not seen it because I don't have Apple TV. Well, I can't give you a real opinion of it. It's probably great, and the fans probably love it. I'd love to have worked on it. I was not asked to work on it, along with a couple of the other old folks. It goes back to that lineage thing. It would have been very cool if they had gotten the original creative team together and let those people a part of evolving it forward. And they did, a couple of people. There were a couple of the original producers who were on the writing team, but very remotely involved. That doesn't necessarily mean it's not a great show, but I am really a fan of keeping it, the idea of evolution is when something evolves, whatever it is, it transcends beyond what it was originally, but it includes all of that groundwork. Otherwise, it's not really evolution. It's just a different thing. And I love the idea that these things evolve, that you don't just start over painting the picture. There's a basis for it, and you build on top of that. So I would have loved to have been involved in it. And Wembley was a character, it's Sprocket too, but a character that I loved. It was really just me when I was 23 years old. It was therapy for me doing my little puppet. Because I had I had like this hummingbird, metabolism, and I was flitting from place to place. I could never make up my mind. So it really was just me coming through this character. And I would love to have had the chance to take him forward. I'm not saying you shouldn't watch it, but I'd love to have done it.
Yeah, Apple TV, by the way, if you don't have it, it's terribly underutilized. It's very cheap. They don't have a huge selection. It's not Netflix, but man, they curate really well. There are so many more hits on Apple TV Plus than there are misses.
Right.
On my podcast, we're always like, we are not sponsored by Apple TV Plus, but it sounds like we are.
Yes,
because every time we're like, oh, this is on Apple TV Plus. It's fabulous. It's like, no, we're not shilling for Apple TV Plus. They do not pay us. But it's so great. But no, it's not a bad show. But something's missing, and I couldn't quite figure out what it was. I need to go back. Maybe I was in the wrong frame of mind when I went and watched it.
I could only speculate, but if I had to speculate on that and on a lot of the more recent Muppet things, I would say it's probably Jim's influence, because that is what is disappearing from most of the work.
It's fading.
Yeah, the people who worked most closely with Jim are either getting old or retiring or, God forbid, passing on. And with less of us involved, there are decision makers who worked with him less. Some of them knew him, but they worked with him a lot less, and they weren't there when we were shooting the material. And his method and his way of being in the room was quite different, Yeah.
Couple minutes left. Any questions?
Yeah.
Anybody? Ooh. Ladies first.
Yeah, go ahead. If you need to, but we're so close, I can probably hear you.
I saw this episode of Sesame Street.
Yeah.
It was like all of Kermit's best moments.
Oh, yeah.
Where the blue, I can't remember his name, was giving Kermit an award.
Oh, Grover. Yeah.
Was that yours, Kermit?
I think so. I think that was me. Yeah, that was after Jim had passed away. Of course, most of Sesame Street with Kermit is Jim. We did a few Sesame Street things with Kermit after I was doing Kermit. And that was one of them, I think. I remember that show. It's funny, I would not have remembered except that somebody was talking about it yesterday and showed it to me. My early days of Kermit. So much fun. I was really just sinking my teeth into being the character. And I could have never done that character if I hadn't known Jim. I mean, it would have just been impossible. Yeah. Jim and Kermit were just, they were the same entity to a large degree. Yeah.
Sounds like it.
Yeah.
Do you have a question?
I have two.
Yeah.
I relate to Gonzo, talking weirdo. And also, my parents Muppets because I miss Piggy.
Uh-huh.
I don't know about the dad like Kermit, but in the scene from the Muppet movie when Kermit and Miss Piggy marry, is that fantasy or are they actually married?
God, what a question. The question that has plagued Kermit for, 30 years now. Well, I don't know. Jim played it as though it was just a scene in a movie with Kermit. Kermit always said, no, it's just a scene in a movie. And Piggy would always say, sure, right, Kermit, right. So they got a lot of mileage off of that. I will tell you that by the time I was doing Kermit, because at that point it was still Frank doing Piggy, so it's Frank and I. Frank was really tired of all of that. He was like, we were both saying, because everybody loves it. Everybody wants Kermit and Piggy to be an item and to have these, it's what you expect. But we were like thinking, what can we do with this? It's just like all they ever ask us is, are you married? Are you not married? And we kept trying to get away from it and we just couldn't. It had to be, So my question, I can only speak for Kermit and say it was just a movie. But then in this last series, they broke up. I don't know whether you guys saw the ABC one. The worst thing to me about that show is that we never saw them get back together, and I think they should have. I didn't mind them breaking up. I just, sorry the show got canceled before we resolved it, And there was a lot of talk, people were saying, well, Miss Piggy represents women in this era, and, she shouldn't be dependent on a man. And okay, I'm good with all that, but still, they've had this relationship for 30 years. It'd be nice if they got back together.
The character dynamic.
Yeah, the character needs to be there.
I think we got time for one more. Anyone?
Yeah.
My favorite is Muppet Treasure Island.
Yeah.
And you were talking about how much how technical it is just moving them, the Xerxes around the room. In Muppet Treasure Island, Kermit sword fighting and falling off cliffs. Was that, even harder to pull off, or was it?
That was one of the few times when we, shot against a blue screen. Blue, because, you can't shoot Kermit on a green screen. Just 2 eyes, But yeah, that was a difficult shot. We had a Kermit, the actual flipping was this rig that they built. Imagine a full figure Kermit posed in a position and this thing that went right through his hips. So you're turning it like a turning thing, So it's like one of these. And I'm in a blue suit, And I don't know the number, but my recollection is we must have done 60 takes on that. And it was really hard and we did it in place. I didn't have to run doing it. We did it in one place, but we had to make him look like he jumped, do a flip, land, jump again, do a flip, land. Even though it was in position, it was really hard to make it look right because in the edit, they were going to move him along a line, like what you eventually saw. And I think we only got it right maybe the one time that they actually used in the film. It was really hard. Very cool thing though. I love that we did something like that.
Yeah. That's awesome. The technical challenges are always.
Yeah.
Everyone, give it up for Steve Whitmire.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Thank you for watching this video. I am Invader Zim, and I traffic in doom. And so, if you do not subscribe to this channel, you will have doom that befalls you by me, Invader Zim.